Hey YouTube friends, it's finally spring, and depending on where you live, it's almost time to plant a garden. Some of you live in warmer climates where it's already time to plant. So today, I thought I would share 4 great ways you can plant a garden. I'm going to show you each method, and I'm going to discuss their benefits and drawbacks. Whether you're new to gardening or an experienced green thumb, maybe one of these growing methods is something you'd like to try this season. So let's dig in. Gardening is something just about anyone can do. It can be as simple as growing an indoor houseplant or as complex as a large outdoor garden intended to supply food for your family homestead. The first thing to do then is decide why you want to garden. That may help you determine what size garden you need and what gardening methods may be best for you. There are several reasons that I grow a garden. First of all, I enjoy working outside. It gives me a chance to clear my head and work off a little stress. And second, I like the taste of fresh produce, and I appreciate knowing I grew it myself. There's nothing better than fresh tomatoes and potatoes and corn, and I like trying new things that you can't find in the store so I can grow them myself. Third, I like to experiment and learn how to grow my own food. I may not actually need to grow my own food since I can go to the grocery store and buy it, but I like learning the skills to be self-sufficient just in case I ever need them. And fourth, I like sharing these videos because maybe there's someone out there in YouTube land who really needs to know these skills about how to grow their own food, maybe right now or maybe sometime down the road. Why do you want to grow a garden? Leave me a comment and let me know. All right, let's look at 4 different ways you can grow a garden. First of all, the simplest way is to grow it right in the ground. The benefits of growing a garden in the ground is that it's the simplest, cheapest way to grow a garden. You don't have to build a raised bed. You just go out and you dig up the ground, you kind of break up the soil in the ground, and you use what's already there, and you can just get started. I mean, if you've got the space in your yard and maybe in your backyard, you can just go right out there and dig up that soil and get it going. So it's easier to do that. It's quicker to get started. And honestly, it's easier to water it that way. There are irrigation systems, sprinklers, drip tape kinds of systems that you can use to water your in-ground garden. And it's pretty simple to do and makes growing there much easier. With the raised bed, it can be a little more complicated to use irrigation systems because the shapes and sizes of the raised bed don't necessarily lend themselves to a sprinkler system or even a drip tape system, although there are some out there that you could use. But there are also some drawbacks to growing in the ground. First of all, if you're growing in the ground, you are pretty much dealing with the soil that is there. And if you've got great soil, very fertile soil, well, then that's fine. But a lot of times, if you live where I am, the ground here is really hard packed. It's full of clay, and it really takes a lot of work to get it to grow. And it may not necessarily have a lot of organic material or nutrients in the soil. So I have to do a lot of work to make my in-ground plots usable, adding a lot of soil amendments, fertilizer, compost, and those sorts of things, and really working it into the soil. And that can be complicated, and it takes a little bit of work. Another drawback with in-ground plots is that oftentimes there's going to be more weeds in that in-ground plot. If you are like me and you're making your garden beds where there have been lawn or grass or weeds that were growing, it can be difficult to get rid of those weeds. Of course you can, dig up what's there, but there's always going to be seeds that are down in the soil. There's going to be roots that are down in there that are going to continue to try to grow. Whatever was there wants to continue to be there, and it takes a lot of work to get rid of those weeds. And you don't have those problems with some of the other methods of growing, or at least not to the extent that you might have it in the in-ground bed. Another issue is that typically you're going to have a shorter growing season because the ground that's actually in the ground, the dirt that's in the ground, is probably going to be colder than what is in a raised bed that's raised up and getting more sunlight. The ground that's underneath our feet, it tends to hold that cold temperature from the winter and takes longer to warm up. So it may take a little bit longer for it to get warm enough for you to plant in it after the winter. And then there's also issues about how well does the soil drain. And it depends on what kind of soil you have where you live. It could, if it's like mine, I have a really thick clay. It does not drain well at all. And poor drainage is not good for a garden. So I can certainly grow, and you can see I've got a nice beautiful green plot of winter wheat growing here. I've also grown corn and some other things as well and been successful, but it took me a while to get this in-ground plot ready and fertile enough to work well. So I've been working on it for about 3 years, and I think I've just about now got it to where it needs to be. Another way to grow a garden is in a raised bed. And this can be a very helpful solution. I started out growing in raised beds because, as I told you before, my soil is not very good. So with a raised bed, I could go ahead and just import all of the rich soil that I wanted to build these raised beds. So these beds did not have any soil that was native to my yard. I brought it all in, which can be kind of expensive, especially if you're buying in those little bags that you get at the home improvement stores. I learned very quickly it was much cheaper to get a truckload of landscaping mix from my local landscaping supply store. I can bring my pickup truck down there and they can use a front end loader to dump cubic load after cubic load into the back of my truck, and it's much, much cheaper. For this raised bed, less than about $25, I was able to get enough soil to fill this bed. So it can be done. And when you do that, you're getting almost like the perfect mix of soil. It's going to be fertile, it's going to have lots of organic material, it's going to be loose and fluffy, and it's going to grow really well. So you can do that, but you have to build the raised bed, which includes the cost of the materials. I built these raised beds out of pallet wood, so it didn't have to buy wood from the lumber store. I got the pallets for free, but it did take a little bit of labor to pull those pallets apart and then to build these raised beds. So, but that's a good way to do it because it has a lot of benefits to it. Now, one thing to remember when you build your raised beds, don't go any wider than 4 feet. When I built this bed, this was the first one that I built, and my thinking was build it as wide as possible because you can grow more vegetables in it. The problem is when you build it more than 4 feet wide, you can't reach into the middle of the bed. So this one here is, I think, 5 feet, maybe a little bit more than 5 feet wide. And so if I plant anything in the middle of it, it's just too hard to reach into the middle. So I still can use it, but I tend to plant around the outer edge of it instead of in the middle of it. Or if I plant something in the middle of it, I plant something that only needs to be harvested one time, or maybe I plant some flowers or something in there that don't need very much attention or to be harvested. But it's better to keep your raised bed no wider than 4 feet. One of the benefits of growing in a raised bed is that you can build it up higher. So like at my church's community garden, we built raised beds that are 2 feet tall. And that's just so convenient because then you could actually sit down on the edge of the raised bed and you don't have to bend over. You just kind of sit there and casually pull weeds or do whatever you need to do in the garden. It's very convenient. And although building it 2 feet tall does require the use of more dirt because now you have to fill all of that in with something. So most of my raised beds here at the house are not that tall. They're only maybe a foot tall, and that's enough to get the soil raised up. It's plenty enough for the plants to grow in it, but it still does require me to bend down a little bit to get inside of it. Some of the other benefits for growing in a raised bed is that you typically get a longer growing season because the soil is up above the surface of the ground. It tends to warm up quicker in the springtime and it tends to cool down slower in the fall. So that gives you maybe a few more days or a few more weeks in your growing season. Also with raised beds, because you're typically using very fertile soil, you can garden it more intensively in a smaller space. You could use the square foot gardening method. You're not worrying about using rows like you would be in an in-ground plot of garden. So you can actually plant things much closer together, pack them in much closer, and you get more produce out of a smaller space. Typically, you're going to have less weeds in a raised bed. Now you can see with this raised bed, it's sort of overgrown with weeds right now because I've not really given it the attention that it needed over the fall. I tried to put these buckets in there to sort of block out and cover up the surface where it wouldn't get weeds in it, but it did anyway. But the good news is that pulling weeds from a raised bed is much easier. I've found the soil is just so much more loose in a raised bed. The weeds just pull out so much easier. And of course, if your raised bed is 2 feet tall, like the ones at my church community garden, you can sit down right on the edge of it while you're pulling the weeds. It just makes life so much more pleasant out in the garden. But the drawbacks of a raised bed is that they're more expensive. You got to pay money for the soil to fill them. You got to pay money for materials to build them. Then you got to spend the time and effort building them and maintaining them so that they last. And that's just extra work. Much more. There's more to it than just going out and digging a hole in the ground and planting some vegetables. Another drawback is that it's harder to irrigate it because, you see how this bed is shaped. Well, if I use a sprinkler on it, most of the water is going to go outside of the raised bed and not on it. I mean, it will get water on the bed for sure, but it's also wasteful because the water's going all over out into the lawn where I don't necessarily want it. So, and you can use drip tape, but drip tape usually comes in really long rolls and it's meant to be laid out in really long rolls in an in-ground garden plot. So it's harder to use that with a raised bed, although there are some systems that are out there. Also, a raised bed typically will use more water. It has better drainage, which is better than an in-ground plot, but because it has better drainage, it means that the water is also going to go through it and it's going to dry out quicker, which means you're going to probably have to water it more often or rely on more rain. Now, another way to grow is to grow in containers. You could grow your garden in containers, and this is really good if you are trying to grow things indoors or if you are growing on a patio or on a balcony. There are different types of containers that you can grow in, and the benefits of growing in a container are similar to growing in a raised bed. You're going to have this, you can put really good soil into your container so that it will be very productive. Also, they are portable. So if you plant, for instance, I like to plant potatoes in these buckets. Potatoes is something that you plant at the very beginning of the season, and it's still a chance that the weather could turn bad and you could get a late frost or a freeze. Last year I had potatoes out in these buckets, and all of a sudden a freeze came up, and I'd already planted and I didn't want to lose all of my potatoes, so thankfully they were in buckets, and I was able to pick each of those buckets up and move them into my garage to get them out of the cold weather, and they did just fine. Just a little work to move them, but buckets are portable, and that's great. They can be moved around. They can be pushed close together when the plants are small, and then as the plants grow, they can be spread out. Or maybe early in the spring season, you have a nice sunny spot, but then as the trees get leaves on them through the growing season, it becomes a shady spot. Well, then you can move those to a different location. There are a lot of benefits to growing in buckets, and buckets are small enough that they can be moved rather easily. Now, you can grow in larger containers as well, such as these storage totes that I like to use for potatoes. They're really good for potatoes because there's more room in there for the potatoes to grow and develop under the soil. But the drawback is that they're very heavy, really too heavy to move around like you can move the buckets. Drawbacks to planting in containers is that, well, it's very similar to growing in raised beds. The plants tend to grow smaller and produce less. You need a lot of containers to equal what you could grow in a raised bed, and certainly a lot of containers to equal what you might be able to grow in an in-ground plot. And then, of course, buckets also tend to dry out faster than what would be in the ground. But there are a lot of different containers you can use. You can use buckets, you can use storage bins, you can use tires, although some people don't like to do that because they say they worry about contaminants being in the tires. I've never had a problem with it. Another way that you can grow, I like to get these barrels. You can usually find them from fairly cheap, 55-gallon drum, and then I just cut them into sections of 3. In a 55-gallon drum, I can get 3 sections, and all 3 of those sections can be used as a very large container. Works great for tomatoes, works great for potatoes and sweet potatoes. And there's lots of other things you can grow in them as well. Something that you may have never thought about using to grow a garden, but it's something that I found a few years ago and I really like it, and I'm going to show it to you today. Hay bales. Hay bales are an excellent option for growing a garden, especially if you have access to a cheap source of hay bales. You know, a hay bale is not that expensive, anywhere from, well, just depends, anywhere from $3, I've gotten them for as cheap as $3, all the way up to $10 that I've seen them. You don't need a really high quality hay bale in order to be successful. As a matter of fact, the poorer the quality of the hay, the better it may be. A lot of times you can find hay bales that are old, that have they've sat around long enough that they're not necessarily as good for feeding horses or cows, but they're still great for growing the garden. As a matter of fact, I think the older they get, the better they are for a garden. The benefits of growing in a hay bale is that this hay is actually rotting and decomposing. So what's inside the hay bale is turning into a very rich organic soil, or planting medium, you might want to call it. So you're basically planting in a composting material. And that means that it's got a lot of nutrients that will help the plants grow well. It also means that you can plant earlier, because even if the air outside is below freezing, the soil is creating and generating its own heat as it decomposes, which actually is like a little small heater for your plant, helping it to stay warm enough to grow faster and to grow when the weather is still cool. It also, you know, these hay bales are about 16, 18 inches tall. So it raises everything up a little bit, just makes it a little easier to get to it. I like to grow things like bush beans in hay bales because, you know, you don't have to bend over so far. They're just already raised up, and then by the time the plants kind of grow up a little bit, they're just right there at the perfect level to harvest really easy. Another benefit for hay bales is if you think of them in terms of the long-term health of your soil. So I told you about my in-ground fields, my plots, and how poor my soil is. Well, one of the ways that I was able to help improve that soil was by putting hay bales all over and planting in hay bales. One of the drawbacks of the hay bales is that they're only good for about one season, and then they're going to decompose and they're going to fall apart. So you're not going to have a good solid hay bale after 1 year. But what happens is that hay bale is now decomposed and it's fallen apart right on top of your ground, and all of that organic material is now in your field. So what you're getting there is if you think of it in terms of like adding compost to your field, then you're actually doing something that's helpful for the long-term health of your garden. So you can kind of use it as a strategy along with a way to plant. There are some drawbacks to growing in hay bales, as there's drawbacks to everything. One of the drawbacks is that the hay bales must be prepped before time. You can't just buy a hay bale, stick it in your yard and plant in it today. What you want is you want to kickstart the decomposition of the hay bale. So some people do that there's like a whole process where you water the hay bale every day and you put fertilizer on it, and you sort of, in the period of about 3 or 4 weeks, you can really get that decomposition started. And I've done that as well. But what I really like to do, which is the easiest thing, is I just try to plan ahead, and I get my hay bales in fall. I put them out in where I want them in the fall, and that way Mother Nature takes its course. The rain comes down, I might add a little bit of fertilizer to it one time, I might put some chicken litter on top of it, and then over the course of the time from fall until spring, Mother Nature does the work for me, and that hay bale is now ready to plant in. It can be expensive because, you know, even though one hay bale is not that bad, and if you're just doing one hay bale, that's probably fine. But if you're doing lots of hay bales, you know, you add up the cost, it can get kind of expensive. But if you have source where you get it for cheap, or if you just have some extra hay bales laying around, maybe you put out fall decorations, and then what do you do with the hay bales after the fall decorations is over? You know, hay bales don't make great spring decorations, but they do make great spring gardens if they've been prepped over the winter. They may require more watering because they tend to dry out quicker, sort of like a raised bed. One more drawback, as you can see on this hay bale, weeds can be an issue with hay bales. Hay is a grass, right? And there's going to be seeds and stuff in it, and when they get wet, they tend to sprout. So you're going to have to stay on top of the weeds and pulling them. But you can get, and some people will say, don't use hay, use straw, because straw won't grow weeds. Well, my friends, these are all straw bales, and you see they are growing weeds. The good news is the weeds are really easy to pull out of the hay bales. It just pulls right out. The hay bales are loose, so they're easy to weed. Plus, you're not bending all the way over to the ground. They're already up off of the ground 16 to 18 inches, so it's a little easier to work with. Once you get the weeds kind of under control and you just stay on top of it, it's not too bad. Now you can plant directly into the hay bales. They work great for things like potatoes because you can stuff those things way down in there deep, and then when it's time to harvest the potatoes, you just break the hay bale apart. But you can plant just about anything in a hay bale. You can plant flowers, you can plant tomatoes, you can plant watermelons, you can plant cucumbers, just about anything. You can plant it directly in the hay bale. Another option is to use your hay bales to make a raised bed. If you have 4 hay bales, you can align them in a square shape and leave a hollowed out center inside the middle, and then you can fill that with some really good rich soil, and then that you can grow in the hay bales and in the dirt inside the hay bales. And that is a great way to improve the long-term health of your garden. If you've got a field that you're trying to prep, put a bunch of those hay bale planters on it and grow in them this year, and then at the end of the growing season, bust them all up and mix them all in with the soil that's right there in the ground, and you'll just have a wonderful field that's ready to grow in next spring. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 6 and 7 says, I planted the seed in your hearts and Apollos watered it, but it was God who made it grow. It's not important who does the planting or who does the watering. What's important is that God makes the seed grow. That's the way it goes in life. Maybe something I've said to you today plants a seed and gives you an idea that may grow into something down the road. Or maybe you already had an idea and I just gave it a little water today so you can keep letting it grow. You might do the same thing for someone else. Maybe a kind word you say today, or even a harsh truth or a word of advice might be something that you need to say to someone. Now, you don't have to do all the work. What you do or say today might plant a seed that someone else will water down the road. It doesn't matter who plants the seed and who does the watering. What's really important is that God makes the seed grow. So just focus on doing your part and trust God to send the right people at the right time to do the rest of the work. You do your part, and God will take care of the rest. So let's try to do that. And now let's get out there and let's grow and be fruitful.